So I've been asked a few times what my thoughts are about Sarah J Maas's books. So let's talk about it. Disclaimer, I am not going to be talking about Sarah J Maas in this video. There's a whole separate conversation to be going on about Sarah J Maas as an author, her political views, things she's done in the past, her controversies. In this video, I am just going to be talking about the books that she has written, not about Sarah J Maas in general, but I do encourage you to go and do a little bit of research around her as one of the biggest authors of our time. I think it's important to know who we are potentially supporting. So, that being said, I am not a fan of Sarah J Maas books. I don't think I've ever been a fan of them, but I did go through a phase where I think I've read most of her books at this point. And I think I speak for a lot of people when I say that there is a certain phase of your reading journey where Sarah J Maas just comes into your life and kind of takes over very briefly. For me, it was quite brief. I have it with a few authors. I've done this before, that I'll have one summer where I'm just become obsessed and then just read everything by them. Even if I don't like it that much, like there is something quite addictive, I think, about going into a whole new world of books. So for me, this was quite a few years ago with Sarah J Maas. I've personally always been a fantasy reader ever since I was very young. But I would say Sarah J Maas was one of the first authors I got into of this like newer wave of the young adult kind of romantic fantasy type books. I had normally read like more old school kind of young adult books and fantasy books in general. So I have read, I think, basically all of Sarah J Maas's books. I've read all of the Throne of Glass books, which is her young adult series, and I think I have not read all of the Crescent City ones, but I think I've read all of the current up-to-date like acotar books. And I have been asked a few times on YouTube and on TikTok especially, how do I feel about Sarah J Maas books and like what do I think? Basically, I think there's a time and place for them. They can be very fun. They can be very easy reads. They are like popcorn, they are sweet, and they are like easy to read a lot of because you don't have to be thinking too hard when you're reading them. Not every book that you read has to be a literary masterpiece. They can just be for fun. And I do think some of her books can be very fun. I think personally for me, even when I read them years ago, Throne of Glass, her first series, was too badly written for me to get into in any serious way. But I could see the appeal for some people. And then acotar, I think, actually has its place. Like, it's a fun Beauty and Beast retelling. It's a Hades and Persephone story, the second one. And it kind of can have its place, and it can be fun. But there are so many other better books out there that also scratch the same exact itch and do it better. So that's what today's video is going to be. I'm going to be recommending you a whole host of different books to read instead of reading Sarah J Maas. Maybe you wanted to jump on the hype train and you read some books and you thought, this is just not it and I'm not enjoying this, but I kind of want something of the same flavour. Or maybe you read all of them and you're past your phase of enjoying the Sarah J Maas books and you want something that maybe hits better than those ones did. Whatever your reason for clicking on this video, thank you for being here with me today, and I'm going to be telling you all the books that you should be reading instead of the Sarah J Maas books in general. I'm splitting this into two halves because her books are very different from each other. The Throne of Glass, her first series, is so different to where we've come in terms of her later acotar books and Crescent City. In terms of the tone is completely different. Like, I'm really talking about in terms of the romance and the spice levels. So the first part of this list is going to be focused on more young adult feeling books about this kind of coming of age, going on an adventure, this fantasy romance, this like political kind of world, with a romance but light spice, light to zero spice basically. The second half of this list is going to be for people who do want that kind of spicy, darker romance side to things, and I do have some good recommendations for that as well, that heavily focus on the romance and also the smut of it all, but I think personally are done better than Sarah J Maas. Another thing to mention, I'm not going to be talking about any books that are always on these lists when people say, if you like this, then you should read these. So I do not have in this list Fourth Wing or anything that's like From Blood and Ash or The Cruel Prince. Lots of these that are often recommended, and also I don't often back these. Like The Cruel Prince is kind of fun. The other two I really didn't like. So we're not going to be talking about anything like that in this list. Hopefully it's recommendations that you've not heard of before, or maybe things that you've heard of before that you didn't really know might like fit into one of your interests in terms of reading these books. So let's just jump in. I'm going to start off, like I said, with the young adult, kind of like the zero spice section of the video, so you can skip to the second half if you want just like the more romance focused books, and we will get progressively more spicy as we go. So the first series that I really want to talk about is a series that I am recently reading because I'm doing a read along for these books with two of my friends, which has been very fun. We've done some of the live shows here on YouTube, and that is the Graceling Realm series. I have currently read these two books and I am on the third one, and there's about 6 I think in this series, but these are like a very original young adult fantasy romance series. If you like the Throne of Glass series for its kind of adventure and exploring this entirely new world, this new politics and kind of like young girl against it all, but you liked in the acotar series where you kind of follow different characters and you kind of have prequels and sequels, that kind of thing, then this is a perfect blend of both, because in this series you follow a different main character in each of the books, but basically this is set in a world where people can have graces, and that can be loads of different things. It can be like you have a grace that you are amazing at archery, or you are an amazing cook, or you have like perfect pitch. It can be loads of different things, but in this first book you're following Katza, who has the grace of killing, and basically in this world all the graces are controlled by the king. So she lives with her uncle, the king, in this court, and she is basically controlled by him. And in this first book you follow Katza as she is coming into herself and discovering who she is as a woman, and also falling in love. There is a romance in this first book and in the second book. In these books the character building is its absolute strength. I think the characters are just so incredibly well done. They're really fleshed out, they're really well developed, and you just like really emotionally feel for them. I think a lot of the character dynamics is done with so much nuance, and it's just for its time as well of when it's written. I think it is just one of the only books that I've read that does have this emotional depth and this nuance within character relationships in such an interesting way. And I don't want to do any spoilers or anything because these books are really, really fun. And I am currently on the third book, which is kind of the sequel to the second book, whereas the second book is a prequel, but they jump around. They're very, very fun, and I just think that they are an excellent choice if you want that kind of Throne of Glass feel, but with much more, in my opinion, character depth. Next up, and kind of in a similar vibe, we have Sabriel, which these covers are so ugly, but the books are actually very, very good, so don't let that fool you. This is a young adult fantasy series, and you are following in this first book Sabriel, who is a daughter of a all-powerful mage. And this one is very similar in the fact of there is this great wall that kind of separates this magical kingdom from the ordinary kind of non-magical kingdom, which is obviously similar to the first books in the acotar series. But basically at the beginning of this book, something happens to Sabriel's father, who is this very powerful magician. She has to cross the wall into the old magical kingdom and kind of find where her father is, save the day, and it's this like very magical, very traditional quest-like story centered around Sabriel, who's such a good main character. It's about destiny, there's romance in it, it's a really unique world, and it's very beautifully written often as well. I think it's very descriptive and it's very evocative. The whole setting of this old crumbling kingdom that's surrounded by magic but kind of being corrupted is really well done. So if you're looking for that kind of young adult but quest feeling and it has romance in it, then definitely check out Sabriel. Don't let the very ugly covers sway you. And this is also a series but I have not read on further because I've only recently read this first one. Next up is a book that I'm just using this entire video concept to try and get you to read, one of my favourite authors, and it is Trust of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. So you might think Sarah J Maas and Brandon Sanderson have nothing in common, and you would be mostly correct. But If you like fantasy romance stories following a young girl who's kind of taking on the world. Sorry, my phone keeps dying. If you like young adult fantasy romantic stories about a young girl taking on the world, then try out Tress of the Emerald Sea. This is like feels like a classic adventure story, but it's got so much heart and so much warmth. There is an amazing cast of characters in this, and it flips a lot of the common kind of classic adventure story tropes on their head, and you're centered around Tress, who is such a fun main character as well. Basically, in this world, Tress lives on an island and it's surrounded by sea, but the sea isn't made up of water, it's made up of these like tiny spores. And basically one day her childhood best friend never comes home, and she decides that she has to go on a mission to try and save him. So she leaves her small island, she is traveling on pirate ships, she is going on this big adventure. It's such a fun story. If you like The Princess Bride, this is supposed to be, and it is very evocative of The Princess Bride. It's kind of that slightly satirical version of a romantic fantasy story, but it's just such a beautiful book. One of my favourites that I read last year, and I love Tress and I loved reading it. It's really, really sweet. It's very heartwarming. So definitely give it a try. Next up, if what you really liked about Sarah J Maas books though is the fae element, then I have a good recommendation for you, and it is An Enchantment of Ravens. This book is so fun and really beautifully written as well, and it's a very romantic fantasy story. So where like Tress kind of leans a lot more on the adventure side, Enchantment of Ravens I'd say is more on the romance side, and it's a very, very sweet romance story. I actually really, really loved this one. I can be quite hit or miss with romantic subplots, but I really liked this one. I really backed this romantic subplot. This one is another one if you really like the main couple in acotar, because in this one you are following Isabel, who lives in a place called Whimsy, which is kind of on the borders of the land of the Fae, but it's a land of eternal summertime, and she is a very, very talented artist. And basically in this world the Fae cannot create anything, so they pay high prices for human-made art and any kind of craft or creation. So Isabel is like a very well sought after artist, and she often paints portraits for some of the Fae. And one day she has a brand new client and she paints his portrait, and she accidentally paints human emotions into his eyes, which is this big taboo and this big rule that she has broken. So he whisks her off and takes her off into the land of the Fae to pay the price for this crime. It's just such a fun story. It's like very beautifully written. It's just a standalone as well if you're in the mood just for a standalone romantic fantasy story with Fae. The Fae in this book are done very well. It's much more of a traditional Fae story with these Fae that are very cruel and harsh creatures that are like very different to humans. They're not just kind of like very attractive humans with pointy ears. The romance in this is so sweet. It's like perfectly paced in my opinion, and I also just really liked the plot resolution and like where the plot went. I thought it was so fun. So this one is a great one and more leaning on the romance side. So if your favourite acotar book is the second one in the series, which if you know, you know, it's like definitely the best one in the series, then you might realize that that book is actually based on the kind of myth of Hades and Persephone. It's a Hades and Persephone retelling. So if you enjoyed that and you like that trope of a young girl being whisked away to kind of a palace of night and death and darkness, then you should definitely read other Hades and Persephone retellings. And my recommendation that I recently read is Girl, Goddess, Queen. This is a Hades and Persephone retelling, but it really kind of puts that trope on its head, because in this story Persephone will do anything to run away and not get married. So she's not stolen from her home by Hades, she runs away and begs him to let her stay in his underworld palace kingdom. This one is very focused on the romance in this story, but also has quite an expansive world and quite an interesting political plot that's going on. I think it does really interesting things with the common stories that we've been told about the gods, and it is a really fresh take on the Hades and Persephone retelling, which I personally love. It's one of my favourite kind of retellings to read. Overall, it just feels like a very refreshing love story. So I would really recommend if that's the trope that you like. It's not the slowest of slow burn stories. Like for my preference, I prefer a very slow burn story, but I could really see if you like things about Sarah J Maas's writing that you could really also enjoy this one. Also, a subplot in this story is kind of the main character coming into her own and discovering her own kind of sexuality and how she feels about romantic relationships, and exploring that as a whole topic, which I think is not done really enough, and I think it was done very well in this book. So that is Girl Goddess Queen, and my copy has very cool sprayed edges that say "To hell with love." So next up, and changing gears slightly, we are now moving into the more adult type books. If you like the later stories that Sarah J Maas has put out with bigger casts of characters and kind of messy interpersonal politics and slightly more spice as well, then that's the realm that we're getting into. And the recommendation that I want to make is the Atlas 6. So this is obviously a very, very well known, very well hyped book series, but I do think that you would really enjoy this series if you enjoy the big cast of characters that Sarah J Maas often has, but you just wanted deeper into their interactions and their character interactions and the kind of the psychology behind this big group of people. That is really dealt with very well, I think, in the Atlas 6. Although, we have to mention it, I have read the whole series. I would just honestly take this as a one-off and kind of forget that it's a series. It gets very disappointing, I have to be honest. This one, I loved this book. I loved this first book. It's just done so well. There's so many fresh and interesting ideas in this first book. In terms of the second and third book, it does go drastically downhill in terms of the plotting and also the characters and also everything. I really didn't like them. But the first book is done very, very well, and honestly was a 5-star read. This one is very different from some of the other recommendations on this list. It's slightly more set in the real world. It's not a completely different world. It's also a dark academia kind of story, but it is a fantasy and it has a focus on these character relationships, and a lot of the fun of this book is also kind of the potential romantic pairings, and it has a tiny little sprinkling of spice, but that's not really the kind of main thing about these books. So in this story there are 6 different magical people who are at the top of their game in terms of their chosen kind of discipline, and they are all invited to join the Alexandrian Society, meaning that they will get access to the Library of Alexandria, or in this world it's kind of like all knowledge that they could ever want. So they all decide to join, but there is kind of a deep dark secret that is being held back from them that they have to figure out, and they are all pitted against each other. So it's very fun, it's very focused on that kind of conflict between the characters, and this first book, why I loved it, is about that real psychology, this group psychology, being inside every single different person's head, seeing the way that their actions are interpreted by other people and their kind of intentions. It's very interesting, and also lots of the writing is very romantic as well. So that is the Atlas 6. So it's kind of like a half recommendation for me. It's like a difficult one to recommend, but I kind of wanted to put it on here as well. So for these last 2 books, these are the books that we're talking about real spicy. Like, we're going into the smutty, we're going into the often like dark romance side, so we are like taking a big step up. And I think that I'm a bit like fussy with how I like my romance, like especially like spicy romance. I do also think it's very personal for everyone. Like, what you find cringy versus what you find good is going to be such like a thin line sometimes. So I could only actually think of 2 book series or like authors that I could recommend for this like spicy dark fantasy romance, because there are some other kind of like fluffier smutty romance books that I can think about that are fantasy, but it's not quite equivalent. Like, it's not a guarantee that you would like it if you came from really enjoying the sexy scenes in Sarah J Maas stories. So the first one I want to talk about, also I want to do a big warning. This one is not for everyone, and I really understand the criticism that this book series gets. I didn't actually finish it. I think I read the first 3 or the first 2 books, but it is the Plated Prisoner series, and big warnings, big content warnings for this one, especially if you read the first book. Lots of people say actually skip the first book and just start with the second one because the first one's kind of prequel. I just read the first one and then read the second one, and it's definitely a lot. Like from the get-go, from that first chapter, you are right in the action, if you get what I mean. But this story is, I think, really interesting. It's also a retelling. It's a King Midas retelling, so the king who could touch anything and turn it to gold. In this book, you are following Orin, who was rescued by King Midas when she was a young girl, and she lives with him in his castle as kind of one of his treasures, basically. And she is very grateful to him for saving her, but they have a very twisted relationship. And like I said, it's a very intense book series, and I actually thought it was very well done in the fact of how it was dealing with Orin's trauma of her childhood and her young adulthood, and kind of lots of the realizations that she has. I do think that a lot of the criticisms of this series are very well placed, and it's definitely not for everyone. But if you are looking for something that is dark and intense and has all of that smut that you are looking for from the like later Sarah J Maas series, then, and you haven't tried the Plated Prisoner series, then I do think it's probably worth a try, especially if you are more comfortable with darker kind of books, then maybe you will like them. And then the final recommendation that I have for this video, also very, very spicy, also very focused on the romance, but have also good fantasy subplots. But basically the whole backlist of Katie Robert. She does a few different types of book series. Some of them are fantasy and some of them are more like dark romances, but like contemporary romance, I think. I've only ever read her fantasy romance ones, and I've really, really enjoyed two of them, and I didn't like one of them as much. But there's definitely so much there to explore, and it's like very, very fun to see all the different series and how they interconnect as well, because she does quite a few series that have characters that you follow different characters in different books, but it's like part of a wider series, and there's kind of lots of overlap with them as well, which if you like that in Sarah J Maas, then you will get that as well with the Katie Robert series. So the two series that I want to shout out are her Dark Olympus series. I actually haven't read any books from this series yet, but they do come highly recommended from Tasmin, who really likes Katie Robert books. And also if you like the Hades Persephone retelling, like I was explaining earlier from acotar, then these are also, there's a Hades Persephone's retelling in the Dark Olympus series. But the ones that I've read are from the Deal with the Demon series. I read 2 books in this series as well, and these are personally more up my street. And also I would say this is more for if you like the kind of the winged aspect of the acotar like series in the Crescent City. If you like the idea of many species together and falling in love, interspecies romance, then you will definitely like the Deal with the Demon series, because that is heavily featured in the Deal with the Demons. So I do think if that's what you're looking for, then that's the series that you should go for, and I can very much recommend that series. So I think that is all 8 books that I wanted to talk about. There is really something for everyone in here. We start off very kind of light with the young adult questing stories, and then we get into the very dark and smutty interspecies kind of romance by the end of it. So I really hope that you found something to enjoy if you do like Sarah J Maas, or if you, like me, previously had a phase and you are ready to move on, then I hope you find something from this list to enjoy as well. Let me know if you've read any of these books. I would love to know your thoughts on them. And if you have very different thoughts to me on Sarah J Maas, I would also like to know that as well. Let's chat in the comments. It'll be a great time. But if you have not yet subscribed, then please remember to subscribe and watch all of my other videos. And I will talk to you again soon. Bye!